Doing a lot of multitasking today. And where did that go? Oh, here we go. Okay. So normally when I give a workshop on clickers, I hand out physical clickers to people, and then you can all participate. We demonstrate it, we work through it. We're not going to be able to do it the same way here because in the environment in which we're working remotely, the only way in which we can do that is if everyone has a mobile app. And while you can create an account for free and set up an account, it's only good for a couple weeks. So I don't want people to waste that in case they want to try it later. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how clickers work, why you might think about using them, and so forth. We've adopted a clicker standard at SUNY Oswego about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, somewhere around then, and that's iclicker. It's one of the two biggest clickers out there. Most campuses adopt either this or the Turning Point clicker system. There's a few others out there, but these tend to be among the least expensive and the most commonly used. And let's talk a little bit about why you might think about using them and why other things are popping up on my screen. One more time. Okay. Um, so so why might you use them? And what? Okay, apparently I messed up my slides. Let me jump ahead. Do I still have some? Okay. The main reason for using clickers is that they offer some opportunities for enhancing student learning. They provide retrieval practice. We've known for over a century that one of the most effective ways of encouraging long-term recall is by having students retrieve information. And clickers provide a nice way of doing it, that you can have them do some readings and then ask them to retrieve it and apply it in some way. Or you could, if you're doing some interactive lecturing, you could give a lecture, or if you're doing a flipped classroom, you could have them watch videos, and then when they're in class, give them some questions that involve applications of that. Um, it makes any lectures you provide much more interactive, which breaks it up. It brings students back to attention and focus. If you've ever tried giving a long lecture, students would probably be better off if you didn't. But if you are giving a long lecture, breaking it up every few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe 12 minutes or so, and giving them some questions, asking about applications, brings everyone attention and focus right back to the forefront. And it's also giving them some feedback. It's letting them know how they're doing, whether they've missed something, whether their attention wavered. And it's giving you feedback and letting you know whether students have learned the material you thought they did, whether they come in with preconceptions that might interfere with their learning. And there's lots of things you can do with clickers. You can ask for opinion type questions. You can ask them for simple recall. You can ask for applications. Most use of clickers involves multiple choice, but they don't have to. In large classes, it's almost exclusively multiple choice, primarily because you don't have to do any manual grading on it. But we do have options that provide more. Um, Clicker use in class is most effective when you combine it with peer instruction and just-in-time teaching. And this technique was actually developed about 20 years ago, or 21 years ago now, by Eric Mazur. And the method that he found to be most effective is to find questions that students find challenging that require a fair amount of cognitive processing, engagement with the material, where they really have to think about what you're asking them and do some application, some transfer of knowledge. And his goal, or he found that the most learning seemed to occur when you found questions that somewhere around 40 to 60% of the students would get correct, and a similar proportion would get wrong the first time. If the questions are too easy, you're mostly wasting time on it. It doesn't really require them to think about concepts as much. If they're too difficult and too challenging, then students aren't quite ready and they'll get discouraged and frustrated and so forth. And the way he suggests doing this basically is asking a question and then letting them do some peer discussion on it. In a classroom, you generally have students turn to a neighbor and talk about the answer, and then you'd vote again. If you're doing this remotely over Zoom, a common practice is to send people into breakout rooms for those questions where it's important to have them go over it. If a fairly large proportion get the question correct, you could just, if you're physically talking with them in a classroom, you could just ask them why they chose particular answers and discuss it. You could do the same thing with Zoom chat. And have students explain why they picked answers and ask questions and so forth, and you can give them feedback. But if you have questions that a fairly significant portion of your students get wrong, send them into breakout rooms, let them discuss it, and then bring them back and have them vote again. That's where the most learning gains have occurred. And they've studied this in a variety of situations. And Carl Wyman and two of his colleagues found that when they did a controlled experiment where they were offering classes with clickers and without clickers that were otherwise the same, but half of them had clickers embedded, there was on average, combining pre and post test score, or looking at the gain in learning from the pre-test to the post test, the students in classes where clickers were used on average saw an increase in their performance of essentially doubling the learning gains. Eric Mazur, in a study that he did at Harvard, found that there were learning gains of 300%. I just posted the description of the lower one because the 300% seems to be a bit of an outlier. But virtually every study that's been done has found that there are significant learning gains when you break up your lectures and you ask students questions, and when they're asked to actively engage with the content. And again, you don't even have to lecture. You could have your lectures be something that students work on or review outside of class, and then you spend your class time working through problems and assisting them. And that's a flipped classroom model, which again has been fairly effective in many disciplines. But in virtually all studies, when clickers are used or polling is used with this type of peer instruction and feedback, there are significant learning gains in nearly every study. Now, one thing that's found is that students virtually always enjoy it, that student engagement goes up, their perception of the quality of the class goes up, their enjoyment of the class goes up. But again, from our perspective, the learning gains are kind of important. And one of the nice things that's been found is that in some of these studies, they've gone back and measured how much students recalled a month or a year later, and they found that the learning gains were significant, not only greater in the classes where there were clickers, but that effect persisted over time, with studies of up to a year later, when students were asked about questions from the class, the students that were in the classes where clickers were used ended up remembering significantly more than the classes where clickers had not been used. And this particular study by Carl Wyman and his colleagues showed the distribution of scores, and pretty much the whole distribution is shifted over. There's very little overlap between the performance on the learning gains. So that the students who did best in the class without clickers were right at the very bottom of the group where the class had used clickers. So Crossgrove and Curran were the ones who had first looked at the long-term knowledge retention, and that's pretty significant. There's a video here. Because this is a short session, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but one nice side effect is that if you're using clickers in classes, you get better attendance if it's going to be graded, because students do respond to incentives. And even if it's a really tiny portion of their grade, it does affect their likelihood of actually showing up and being actively engaged. You can't just sit back and do something else while your screen is connected to Zoom if you're actually going to be actively participating in this. Students get interested. They want to know the impact of this. When Eric Mazur was here about 6 or 7 years ago, I think it was now, he gave a presentation, and I know I've used this before and some of you have heard this, but he gave a little demo where his field is physics. And he said one of the questions, he actually worked through an example where he had loaner clickers that he gave out to everybody. And we had a group of about a couple hundred faculty there. And he showed a picture of a plate of metal with a hole in the middle. And he said, what would happen to the size of the hole in the sheet of metal if we put it in an oven, we heat it up by 200 degrees? Will the hole in the plate get bigger or smaller? And then he had people vote on it, and then without talking, and then he had people discuss it. And then vote again. And that discussion, the volume of in that lecture hall in Shinneman, it was in Shinneman then. So it may have been a little bit more recently, went up dramatically. And then he said, now look at how actively you were engaged in this. If I gave a lecture on what happens to the hole in a plate of metal when it's heated up, it would be about the most boring lecture I can give. And yet you are all out there actively arguing and debating this. And that's why clickers work well. And then he went on to discuss other things. And people got angry because they wanted to know the answer, which was exactly what he wanted to demonstrate. That when people take a stake in an argument and they have an opinion on what's going to happen, they want to know whether it's correct. And that extra engagement is where really much of the learning actually takes place. The extra cognitive processing, the debating, the arguing, the disagreement, and just trying to reconcile these competing opinions are not the types of engagement we normally see in a lecture class. And then he explained what happens. And by the way, the size of the hole does in fact get bigger, and he explained why. But that type of curiosity that's provoked and that engagement is something that we don't see as much when we don't use similar activities. There's other ways of doing it. You can do experiments, you can do polling, but it seems to work really well. And a few things you should avoid if you're using clickers is don't use them just for attendance, because students have to pay for clickers or pay for a subscription. Students would not be very happy if they're just paying $16 for 6 months or $25 for a year just to have their attendance being taken. There's easier and better ways of doing that if that's what you want to do. Now, a side effect of using clickers every class is you are taking attendance, but the goal is to do it for learning. And if you sell it to students as that, because that's what's really happening, students are much more likely not to be upset about the fact that they may have to pay extra for it. And typically, when we're in a face-to-face environment, students could buy a radio frequency clicker, and they could buy it new for about $45 or used for about $20, and then they could use it through all 4 years. So it's relatively inexpensive. Now that we're in a virtual environment, or many of us are, or we might be at any given day, students have to buy a subscription for it. And those subscriptions cost either $16 for a semester, $25 for a year, or I believe it's about $42 or $43 for a 4-year subscription. And then they can use it on any mobile device or any web connected device. And again, it's up until this past fall, when we had some issues with the integration with Blackboard. It took a while for CTS to be able to get that installed. It was a busy summer, and they were busy with lots of projects, as we all know. But we ended up going from a 2 or 3 dozen classes that have been using it regularly every fall down to 2. So right now we're at a somewhat low point in clicker use, but I'm hoping that now it will pick up, because basically the old integration we had did not support running it remotely. I used it this fall, and it worked flawlessly throughout the fall semester. And there was someone in physics, I believe, or chemistry who used it, but we were the only ones who did it. Yes, there is something that needs to be done for integration. Well, the integration is already done, and it was something that we could have done actually last January, but it was discovered, or the problem was discovered after the semester began. So it was too late to do it, because everyone would have had to reconfigure the clickers, and people had already set it up for last spring. And again, it just took a long while for CTS to get around to it.
The reason I'm asking, John, is because I was trying to set up my clickers for my courses. And for some reason, I cannot select the courses from the iClicker interface. It doesn't communicate with Blackboard.
You need to use the new integration, which I put up on the website last fall, and there's a new version I put up on the website last night, and I'll share it. That's what the next session is all about, setting it up. It is on the CELT website, so you need to download the new version of it with that integration. Okay, so if you go to the CELT website, and it's buried deep, the website was redesigned. I wasn't involved in that part of it at the time, but you have to go to learning resource or resources, and then learning resources, and then clickers, and then or best practices. We've got the next session.
Okay.
These are short, so at 2:30 we'll be talking about that if you can stick around. Otherwise, it'll be recorded and posted. So
no, there was a 7.23 as a version. up
Yeah,
until
it's actually 7.25 now.
six,
So
7.26.
Oh, 7.26 is the current version, right?
Yep. Yep. Okay.
7.23 is the one that was available at the start of last semester. Okay. But so yeah, you do need to have the current version, and that will work throughout the spring semester. But yeah, the update just happened 2 days ago, or 2.5 days ago now. So um, if you're going to use clickers, use them regularly, plan to use them regularly. I'd recommend at least once or twice every day. I often use them 12 to 15 times in each class, but my class meets Tuesday, Thursday. But, students would not be very happy paying for an app if they're only going to use it 2 or 3 times in the semester. And that has happened in a couple of classes, and students fairly rightfully, I think, were upset about that. One thing that we have to be concerned with is students are in difficult circumstances, and we should be fairly understanding of them not being able to be there all the time, especially now. But in general, when we were meeting face to face and students were using the physical clickers, students would often forget them, their batteries would go dead, or their clicker may die if they bought a used one. It was 7 or 8 years old and they dropped it or something. And students do sometimes have to be away. One of the things that most clicker users do is they allow for a certain number of missed scores, just dropping the lower scores in Blackboard. Typically, my class meets twice a week. When I use these in the fall, at least, and I generally drop the 5 lowest clicker scores to allow for any absences due to illness, due to anything. So they had 2.5 weeks of classes where they wouldn't have any clicker scores without any penalty. So, and that's, I think pretty much everyone does that because things do happen. And I already talked about trying to find questions that are relatively challenging. The Eric Mazur method works really well. Another thing that most people do, and I'd strongly encourage it, is to give some points for any answer, but more points for a correct answer. Because if you're going to find questions that are relatively challenging, if half the class is going to get it wrong, it could be fairly discouraging if a typical question is only going to that you're using for a learning activity is only going to have, say, an average of 50% for a typical student. So what most people will do is give them some points. Some people give them half credit for any answer and full credit for a correct answer. I generally, and I think several people in the economics department generally give 3 points for any answer and 5 points for a correct answer. And if on average, half of them get it correct, half of the students get it correct, then you'd have the average between 60% and 100%, or on average, it would be about 80% of the grade. Most people weight the scores somewhere around 10 or 15% of the total score. Some people go as high as 20%, but it's generally a low stakes activity. So on any given day, it's only at most about 1% of the grade. In my class, it's generally significantly less than 1% of the grade, especially with the 5 lowest scores being dropped. And make sure you give them feedback. Just asking students questions, letting them discuss it is not very helpful unless you provide some correction, some explanation of why the correct answer is correct and so forth. And there's more details on there. Now, one thing I meant to include, but it got to be about 3 o'clock this morning and I had to get some sleep, is that now we have 2 options for clickers. We have the iClicker Classic, which is what we've used before, which is simply multiple choice and nothing more. We also have a cloud-based system, which is iClicker Cloud, which does include multiple choice, but it also includes free responses. It also includes heat maps where you could have an image and they have to click on certain portions on the image. So it could be a map, for example. It could be a graph. It could be something similar. And you can define zones there for the correct answer. So, you could ask them, in what direction will a curve shift? Or in what state do we see something? Or, depending on your discipline, if it's an art project, you could have an image and they could click on certain parts of the graph, parts of the image that would represent certain features of light or shadow or something similar. So there's a lot that you can do. If you have free response, you have to manually grade it. And because I often teach classes of 2 to 420 students, generally, I wouldn't want to be manually grading every clicker question that was used. So I tend to stick more to multiple choice, but you could, have numeric answers. And so iClicker Cloud offers more options. And that in our current environment, that works beautifully. If we go back to the classroom, though, it would mean that every student would have to use some mobile app. So they'd have to have a subscription to it, and they would have to use either a smartphone or a computer or laptop, Chromebook, or any web connected device. But in general, students find it pretty interesting and useful. If it's an iClicker cloud, you log into the website, they log into the website, and everything works fine. If it is, so the subscription price is exactly the same. And from the student standpoint, once they sign up with iClicker and they download the iClicker Reef polling app to their smartphone, or they log into it, it will work equally well on a mobile device in either context. But if you're back in the classroom and some students have the physical clickers, you have to restrict yourself to only multiple choice answers, because you can't use a heat map when they only have 5 buttons, basically. So you could use iClicker Cloud and have it if you're teaching a hybrid environment or if you're teaching an environment that's face-to-face and you have a lot of magical thinking that we're all going to be in the semester all semester long and everyone's going to be able to be there, then you could use either iClicker Cloud or iClicker Classic and let students use the physical devices, which are less expensive for students. However, there's a pretty good chance that not everyone will be able to be, even if you're meeting face to face. Some students will end up in quarantine. Some students may have to travel. And, I think for now, we should probably count on everyone using a mobile app, which means you could use any of the types of responses if you choose iClicker Cloud. If you want to stick to just multiple choice, either one could work quite nicely. And again, from the student's perspective, the same app works either way. It's just you can't use physical clickers, radio frequency clickers, if students are not within a couple hundred meters of the classroom. So that's a really quick overview of iClickers and how they work and so forth. What questions do you have? And the subscription price, I think I answered, is exactly the same from students' perspective.
I am going to wait until the setting up stuff because I still have something that I need to ask.
Okay. So, other questions?
John, thank you very much. I have to roll.
Okay, thank you. I've been using clickers, one clicker or another, for about 12 years now, and it's helped. I saw some dramatic increases in student performance. The subscription is $16 for 6 months. It's, I believe, $25 or $24.95 for a year. And I think it's somewhere around 42 or 43 or maybe 38 for a 4-year subscription. And again, the benefits of that will be greater if more people use it. When I did surveys in my classes, when we were meeting face-to-face up through the fall of 2019, I would say probably 50% of my students were using clickers in at least one other class, and probably about 25% of them were using them in 2 other classes. So the cost per class is relatively low when they're heavily used. Right now, it's fallen off because we didn't have it available at a time when it probably would have been most useful. So, which was a source of endless frustration for me and countless emails and conversations with people at CTS last summer. But it is working now. Okay, any other questions? Okay, now, Mihai, let me see. I think actually I have it on my computer. I might be able to just share it in chat. Let me see.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I just downloaded the 7.26.
Okay, because that's what I was going to share in chat, the zip file. You should be able to unzip that and then set it up. And the setup is very much like the old version.
What I'm having problem is to import the roster from the LMS. I can select Blackboard as the LMS, for Oswego.
It'll ask you for the SSO key.
Well, it doesn't. And let me, I cannot share my screen. Otherwise I would have to go-
Yeah, you can. Let me share my screen. Well, let me stop the share.
maybe then
Actually, let me stop the recording.